A woman named Iris wrote to me 2 weeks ago, and I haven't stopped thinking about her since. She said, I was 64 years old. My father left 4 children. My 3 brothers went to court and split everything down the middle, and when the judge was finished, I received the one thing none of them wanted, a condemned house on a hill outside of town that everyone agreed was worth nothing. What the architect found inside that house, and what it did to the 3 men who thought they had won, I need you to hear this. They gave her the house nobody wanted. 3 brothers, 1 court order, 1 judge in Harlan County, who divided their father's estate with the clean arithmetic of a man who believed fairness meant equal shares, and what was left for the only daughter was a 3-story house on a hill outside Grover's Mill, Kentucky, that the county had flagged for structural review in 2011, and that no one had entered willingly in 8 years. Her oldest brother's name was Gerald Vance, contractor, Vance Brothers Construction, a man who had spent 40 years building things and understood exactly which things were worth building and which things were worth tearing down. He looked at the hill house and he saw a tear down and a cleared lot and a number. He believed his sister would accept what she was given. He was wrong, because an architect came to assess the demolition and walked through every room and came back outside and said 4 words that changed everything. And what he found in the basement, in a room sealed behind a wall that had been built specifically to hide it, is the reason 3 men had to sit in a lawyer's office and hear the truth out loud. What happened to Iris Vance after 64 years of being the daughter, after a court order, after a condemned house on a hill, is the reason I read every letter that comes to me. Stay with me. On the morning of April 3rd, 2018, a Tuesday, 11 days after a Harlan County probate judge signed the order dividing the estate of Wallace Vance into 4 equal parts and awarded his daughter the one asset his 3 sons had unanimously declined, Iris Vance drove her 12-year-old Subaru up the pale gravel road to the house on Alderman Hill and sat in the driver's seat for a long time before she got out. She was 64 years old. She had driven this road as a child, as a teenager, as a young woman home for holidays she was glad to leave, and again at 41 when her mother died and her father had packed his things and moved into the 2-bedroom apartment in town, and the house had been left to stand on its own. That had been 23 years ago. She had not driven this road since. The house was 3 stories, built in 1887 according to the county records, with a wraparound porch that had partially collapsed on the east side where a support post had given way sometime in the last decade. 2 upper windows boarded from the inside with what looked like plywood. A chimney that appeared structurally sound from the driveway, though she was not qualified to say, and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to buildings that have been holding themselves together alone for a very long time, without anyone watching or helping or noticing. She had noticed it as a child, that quality, without having the words for it. She had thought of the house as a presence rather than a structure, something that had opinions about who entered it and how. She had not thought about it in 23 years, and now she was sitting in the driveway in a car that needed new tires, and she was thinking about it again. She got out. The air smelled of cedar and creek water and the particular sweetness of Kentucky spring, which is a smell that arrives around the first week of April and lasts perhaps 3 weeks, and which can make a person feel things they were not prepared to feel, things about time and about what has been lost, and about whether lost is the right word for the things you put down on purpose and have not gone back to pick up. She stood in the gravel and looked at the house, and she felt them. Then she put on her work gloves and went inside. The front door was unlocked. She had not expected that, and it stopped her for a moment on the threshold. Not because she was afraid of what was inside, but because it meant someone had been here at some point, recently enough that locking the door had not seemed necessary. The front room was large and square with plaster walls that had gone gray with age and dust, the original baseboards intact, a window on the east side that had lost its lower pane and been filled with cardboard taped from inside, and a fireplace with a marble surround that she had forgotten existed and which, when she crossed the room to look at it, turned out to be in nearly perfect condition. She ran her gloved hand across the marble. It was cold and smooth and unapologetic. She went room by room, which is how you learn a house you don't know yet. which is how you learn anything you've been away from long enough for it to become a stranger. The staircase held. The second floor held. The plaster in the back bedroom had a water stain shaped like a hand and a crack that ran from the window casing to the ceiling, but the floor was sound and the window itself, though its sash was swollen and stiff, opened when she pressed it, and the view from that window was the view she had looked at every morning of her childhood. The hill rolling away south, the tree line at the creek, the pale sky of early April still deciding whether to commit to spring. She was in the kitchen, which was in better condition than she had expected. The floor sound, the cabinets intact, the cast iron drain board over the sink original to the house and uncracked, when she heard a truck on the gravel. She came out through the front door and saw her brother Gerald getting out of a white pickup with Vance Brothers Construction stenciled on the door in blue. He was 68 years old, heavy-set, with their father's broad shoulders and a contractor's habit of looking at structures the way other people look at problems. Not with wonder or curiosity, but with the specific calculating attention of a man who is assigning value in real time and has 40 years of practice doing it. He looked at the house. He looked at Iris. He said, "I didn't expect you up here." "It's my house," Iris said. Gerald shrugged in a way that meant he was being patient with something he found faintly absurd. The shrug had a history. She had been watching that shrug for 50 years, since she was 9 years old, and had announced at the dinner table that she wanted to be a doctor, and Gerald, then 13, had made exactly that shrug, and their father had not corrected him. "Nobody's disputing that," Gerald said. "I came up to take some measurements. There's a buyer interested in the lot once the structure comes down. Clear it, grade it. You'd get a decent number for the acreage. Maybe 80, 85 if the soil tests are clean." "I haven't decided what I'm doing with it," Iris said. "Iris." His voice took on the particular register it had always taken when he was about to explain something to her that he considered obvious. The voice of a man who has decided that patience is a form of generosity he is extending to someone who should be grateful for it. He had been using this voice on her since she was 9 years old. She knew every frequency of it. "The county flagged this in 2011. You'd need a structural engineer to certify it for habitation, which it won't pass. And then you'd need permits and contractors and money you don't have to bring it up to code. And by the end of that process, you'd have spent more than the property is worth. Let me find you a buyer for the land. You take the money, you're done. It's clean." "I'll get an assessment," Iris said, "before I make any decision." "From who?" "An architect." Gerald looked at the house again with the expression of a man who has already written the ending of a story and is mildly curious why the other person hasn't read it yet, hasn't caught up to what he already knows. "Suit yourself," he said. "But I've been building in this county for 40 years, and I'm telling you, that house is not worth saving. The foundation may be compromised. The porch is already going. And whatever's under that roof has been sitting in humidity and freeze-thaw cycles for 20 years without anyone touching it." He got back in the truck. He started it. As he backed down the gravel road, he lowered the window and said, not unkindly, which was somehow worse than if he'd been cruel about it, "Dad knew what he was doing, Iris. He left you what he thought you could handle. Let it go." She stood in the driveway until the sound of his truck had gone completely, and the hill was quiet again except for the creek at the bottom and the specific percussion of a woodpecker somewhere in the tree line. She stood there for a while after the sound was gone too. She went back inside. She stood in the front room and looked at the plaster ceiling and the pressed tin cornice she had not noticed as a child and noticed now, pressed tin Victorian pattern intact all the way around the room. And she was angry in the specific way that comes not from one moment, but from 40 years of moments, each one small enough to dismiss on its own and together large enough to build a house on. She had dismissed each one on its own. She had been a good sport about the shrug at the dinner table and about the question when she was 22 of whether she was really sure she wanted to go back for a second degree, and about the comment at her father's 85th birthday when Gerald had raised the glass and thanked their two brothers by name for their contributions to the family, and had looked at Iris and smiled in a way that included her in the room but not in the sentence. She had been a good sport about all of it, which she understood now was a form of practice for this moment. When she was 64 years old and standing in a front room with a marble fireplace and pressed tin ceilings, and she was done being a good sport. She took out her phone and called a woman named Patsy Greer, who had been her closest friend since nursing school in 1979, who had the particular talent of knowing not just people, but the right people, the ones who were genuinely skilled at their work and who did not also happen to know Gerald, and who answered on the second ring without preamble. "I need an architect," Iris said. "Someone who knows old houses, not someone Gerald knows." "I have exactly one name," Patsy said. "Give it to me." "Elliot Marsh. He restored the Cutter farmhouse outside Berea and the old Meredith mill in Perry County. He's particular. He won't rush." "That's what I want." "I'll send you his number," Patsy said. There was a pause. "Iris, are you all right?" Iris looked at the pressed tin cornice. She looked at the marble fireplace. She looked at the good bones of a room that had been waiting 23 years for someone to come back and see them. "I think so," she said. "I think I might be better than all right, but I need to make this call first." She drove back down to town that evening and stopped at the hardware store for a sleeping bag and a camping lantern and a box of energy bars and a combination lock for the front door. She slept in the house that night on the floor of the front bedroom with the window cracked, and she lay in the dark listening to the building, and it sounded like she remembered old wood settling, the particular creak of the third stair, the creak at the bottom of the hill when the wind came from the south. And she did not sleep for a long time, but she was not afraid, which was the thing she had expected to feel and did not. The architect's name was Elliot Marsh. He was 56 years old, lean and deliberate in the way of a man who has spent 30 years in rooms that required patience. And he drove up to Alderman Hill on a Saturday morning, April 7th, 4 days after Iris's call, in a battered Land Cruiser with survey equipment in the back and a flashlight and a notebook that was already half full when he arrived, because he had spent the previous evening at the county library reading everything he could find about the history of construction on Alderman Hill and the history of the family that had built the house, which turned out to be considerably more than either of them had expected. He introduced himself on the porch, and then, before she could show him inside, before she could say anything, he said, "Before I go in, I want to tell you what I found in the county archive last night. This house was built by a man named Robert Caldwell in 1887. He was an architect himself, trained in Cincinnati, worked in Louisville for a decade before he came to Harlan County sometime around 1884 or 1885. He built 6 structures in this region between 1885 and 1903. 4 of them are gone. 1 to fire, 2 to demolition, 1 to a flood in 1927 that took the whole lower end of the county. One of the remaining 2 is the county courthouse annex on Broad Street." He paused and looked at the house with the focused quality of someone who is simultaneously seeing what is in front of him and what he knows about it. "This is the 6th. He looked at the house for a moment more. "I don't assess many buildings like this anymore, because there aren't many buildings like this anymore. The ones that haven't been altered are almost entirely gone." He went inside. Iris followed and did not speak, because she understood that speaking would cost her something she was not ready to spend, which was the experience of watching a person who knew what they were looking at look at a thing she had grown up inside and never seen. He moved through the rooms with the slow, systematic attention of someone who is reading something that requires full concentration, touching walls with the flat of his hand, testing floors at the perimeter and then the center, looking at the junctions where walls met ceilings and where the plaster cornices had been seated, tilting his flashlight at angles that found things the overhead light would have missed. He said very little for the first 2 hours except occasional single words: sound, intact, original, extraordinary. And these seemed less like observations for her benefit than like a man taking notes in a private language, the shorthand of a specialist accounting for what he finds. The back parlor stopped him entirely. He stood in the doorway for a long time without entering. The parlor was perhaps 20 by 20 feet, with a plaster ceiling that bore a deeply carved medallion at its center, a radiating pattern of acanthus and geometric forms that she had looked at 10,000 times as a child and understood now she had never actually seen, and a continuous decorative frieze around the perimeter where the ceiling met the walls, foliage, and interlocking geometric elements rendered in a pattern that was unlike anything she had encountered in a domestic interior, unlike anything she had seen anywhere except in photographs of public buildings from a certain era. The original plaster was cracked in two places, one near the southeast corner, one running from the window casing toward the medallion, but it was intact, which is not a word that means merely surviving, but means whole, not repaired, not replaced, not covered over. The original surface still present and still showing the original hand. The fireplace around was carved walnut, dark with age, with a mantelpiece supported by two pilasters in a classical style that she had always known was unusual but had not had the language to describe. And on the mantelpiece itself, inset in the frieze of the surround, was a panel of decorative tiles, 16 of them in a grid, hand-painted, each one different, each one depicting a different element of what she recognized now as local botanical forms: wild carrot, bergamot, the particular leaf shape of a Kentucky buckeye, a climbing trumpet vine rendered in ochre, and deep blue and a green so specific it looked like it had been mixed from the creek bed itself. "Caldwell made those tiles," Elliot said from the doorway quietly. "I've seen two others. One is in a private collection in Louisville. I've photographed it. One is in the Kentucky Heritage Museum in Frankfurt in a display about regional architectural ornament. They came from different buildings. I've spent years wondering where the rest of them went." He was quiet for a moment. 16 in one panel. That's more Caldwell tile in one room than exists anywhere else I know of. He turned around slowly and looked at the ceiling and the cornice and the plaster frieze. "Do you know what's been done to this house since 1903? My grandfather bought it in 1931, Iris said. My father grew up here. I don't think anyone changed much." "That is," Elliot said, "exactly what I was hoping you would say." He continued through the house. He went to the basement, which was stone-walled and dry, the foundation in the condition of something that was built well and has been left alone, which is sometimes the best thing that can happen to a foundation. He tested the floor joists from below with a screwdriver, pressing the tip into the wood at intervals, checking for softness, for the give of rot. And he said nothing, but he nodded twice, which she was beginning to understand was his version of significant. He came back upstairs and she followed him down the back hallway, and he was almost to the far end. He was reaching for the basement door to close it when he stopped. He stopped and looked at the wall at the far end of the hallway, the wall that had always been there, the wall she had walked past 5,000 times as a child without thinking about it. He put his hand flat against it. He knocked with his knuckle once, twice at one point. Then he moved 18 inches to the left and knocked again. He looked at Iris. "How long has this wall been here?" "As long as I remember," she said. "It was always just a wall." "It's not original," he said. He put his hand against it again and pressed lightly. "The framing is from the 1960s at the latest. The dry wall is certainly 60s or later. Someone built this wall in front of something." He did not try to open it. He stepped back and looked at it for a long time, the way you look at something when you are deciding what the responsible thing to say is. Then he went outside. Iris followed. He stood on the porch in the April morning and looked out over the hill and the bare going green tree line and the pale sky, and he was quiet for a long time. And she had the distinct sense that he was organizing what he wanted to say with the same care he brought to everything. Not performing deliberateness, but genuinely deliberate. A man who believed that the first thing you said in a situation like this would be what was remembered. He turned to her. I need to tell you 4 things. The first is that this house is structurally sound. The floor joists are original white oak, and they are in better condition than joists I have seen in buildings half this age. Sound white oak does not rot easily if it has not been wetted repeatedly. These joists have been dry. The foundation is stone, dry laid, and it is not moving. I can see from the basement that there has been no significant settling in at least 30 years. This house is not condemned. The 2011 county flag was based on a surface inspection of the exterior, and whoever filed it did not go into the basement and did not assess the structure properly. I will certify this house as structurally sound in writing this week. He paused. Iris did not speak. The second thing is that this is the most intact example of Robert Caldwell's domestic work that exists anywhere in Kentucky, possibly in the country, since his practice was regional. The plaster, the tile work, the woodwork, none of it has been altered. The cornice in the front room is original. The parlor ceiling and frieze are original. The walnut fireplace surround is original. The tiles are original. There are people at the State Historic Preservation Office who will want to know about this. There are people at the National Register of Historic Places who will want to know about this. This house has heritage value that goes considerably beyond the lot it sits on. He paused again. The third thing is that I don't know what is behind that wall, but I need you to understand that in a house like this, a wall built in the 1960s at the end of a back hallway is not an innocent thing. Someone built that wall for a reason. And given what else is in this house, the question of what someone chose to hide is not a small question. He looked at her directly. His eyes were the light gray of someone who spent a lot of time outdoors. The fourth thing is, do not touch that wall until I come back with someone who should be here when we open it. She said, Who? Someone from the State Preservation Office, he said. I know the right person. She thought about this. She said, How long? A few days. I need to make some calls. He picked up his notebook and his equipment, and he went back to his Land Cruiser, and he drove down the gravel road. And she stood on the porch and watched him go and thought about the wall at the end of the back hallway that was not original, that had been built in the 1960s in front of something, in a house that had been in her family since her grandfather bought it in 1931. Her grandfather, who had died in 1972 when she was 18. Her father, who had grown up in this house and who had, when his own father died, been the one to decide what stayed and what went. Who had lived here until he was 82 years old, and then had packed his things and moved to town and said he was done with the hill and had never come back. Who had, when the time came, left the house to Iris. Not to Gerald, who had the money and the equipment and the connections and the 40 years of building experience. Not to Dennis, who had the business acumen and the patience for process. Not to their youngest brother, Paul, who had the law degree and the attention to detail. To Iris. She had assumed it was because she was the one they could afford to give nothing to. She had assumed it was pity or expediency or the path of least resistance, and she had swallowed that assumption with the same practiced ease she had swallowed everything else, and she had said thank you, and she had signed the papers, and she had come up the hill. She stood on the porch and looked at the tree line, and she thought, what if it wasn't? She did not sleep well that night. She lay on the sleeping bag on the floor of the front bedroom and listened to the house and thought about the wall. 3 days later, on Tuesday, April 10th, Gerald Vance appeared at the bottom of the gravel road in his pickup, while Iris was sitting on the porch steps reading a county history book Elliot had dropped off the previous afternoon, a local history published in 1968 with a chapter on the architects who had worked in Harlan County in the late 19th century, and in that chapter a photograph of a 3-story house on a hill that she recognized before she read the caption. Gerald did not come up the drive this time. He stopped the truck at the road's edge and got out and stood there with his hands in the pockets of his jacket, the posture of a man who is making a point about his own restraint, and said loudly enough to carry up the hill, I've got a number for you. Buyer wants the lot clear. He'll pay $140,000 and close in 60 days. You won't see that number again from anyone else. I'm not selling, Iris said. Iris, I'm not selling, Gerald. Be practical. I am being practical. She set the book down on the step beside her, cover up, and looked at him across the distance of the gravel road and the sloped yard between them. Come back when you have something else to say. Gerald stood at the road for a moment. He looked at the house the way he had looked at it the first time, with the appraising, impersonal eye of a man who sees lots and footprints and cleared acreage. Then he looked at her. He said, and this was the sentence, the one she would carry with her into every room of what came next. You were always Dad's charity case. He gave you the house because he felt sorry for you, not because he thought you could do anything with it. Take the money. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. She looked at him across the distance. She was 64 years old, and she was sitting on the porch of a house with a marble fireplace and pressed tin ceilings and 16 original hand-painted tiles and a wall built in the 1960s in front of something. And her brother was standing at the road's edge telling her she was a charity case. And she looked at him and she felt something settle in her chest like a door closing, quiet and final. She said nothing. She picked up the county history book and went inside. She called Elliot Marsh. When can you come back? She said. Thursday, he said, and I'm bringing someone. Elliot brought a woman named Cecily Drummond on Thursday morning, April 12th, and she arrived in a state vehicle with a university parking decal in the corner of the windshield that suggested she spent her time in at least 2 kinds of institutional settings. She was 60 years old, compact and precise in her movements, with reading glasses pushed up into her white hair, and the particular bearing of someone whose expertise has been earned over decades and has made them calm rather than proud. The bearing of a person who does not need to be the most impressive presence in a room because they are confident in their own authority and do not require your acknowledgement of it. She was the Kentucky State Historic Preservation Officer for the Eastern District, 22 years in the role, and she had been at 2 other sites before driving up to Alderman Hill that morning, and she was not tired. She walked through the house the way Elliot had walked through it, but faster, because she recognized what she was seeing and did not need time to identify it. She moved from room to room with the focused, forward motion of someone checking items from a list she has been building for a long time, and she made notes without stopping. And she said almost nothing until she reached the back parlor, where she stopped and did not make notes and stood at the walnut fireplace around looking at the tiles for a full minute and a half without speaking. Then she said, to no one in particular, in a voice that was very quiet, "There you are." She turned to Iris. "I have been looking for documentation of this interior for 11 years. We knew from Caldwell's project records, his personal ledger, which is held by the Cincinnati Architectural Archive, that the Alderman Hill House was his most fully realized domestic commission. He wrote about it twice in his correspondence with a colleague in Louisville. He described the parlor tiles specifically. He said in a letter from 1894 that they were the finest work he had done with his hands and that he did not expect to do finer. She looked at the tiles again. We have one photograph of this house from 1901, taken by a county photographer for a regional almanac. It shows the exterior only. We have never had access to the interior. I requested access 3 times after the family moved out, and each time the estate declined. She looked at Iris. The plasterwork alone would qualify this building for National Register listing. The ceiling medallion is extraordinary. I have not seen its equal in a Kentucky domestic interior. Combined with the intact tile work and the woodwork and the cornice, this is almost certainly the most significant Caldwell interior in existence. She turned to look at the wall at the end of the hallway. Is that the wall? She said to Elliot. That's the wall, he said. They opened it together that afternoon. Elliot with a pry bar, working carefully, removing the drywall in sections that he stacked against the opposite wall, while Cecily documented with her phone camera and a written log. The drywall came away in large, clean pieces, which told you something about the construction. It had been put up carefully by someone who knew what they were doing, someone who was not in a hurry, and was not hiding something in a panic, but doing it with the deliberateness of a considered decision. Behind the drywall was the framing, 2x4s in the standard spacing of the era, and behind the framing was a door. Solid wood, original to the house, with a mortise lock of the kind that had been standard in the 1880s and 1890s. The lock had been painted shut at some point. There was a thick ridge of old paint along the gap between door and frame. And then the wall had been built in front of it so that the door was not merely locked, but was invisible, was not a door at all to anyone who came to this hallway after the wall went up. Elliot worked the lock free with a thin, flexible blade, working the paint ridge carefully, not forcing it, taking 15 minutes to do it properly rather than 5 minutes roughly. The door opened inward. The air that came out of the room was cold and dry and absolutely still, the specific stillness of a space that has been sealed long enough for the air inside it to become its own microclimate, separate from the seasonal changes and humidity variations that had moved through the rest of the house for 60 years. The room behind the door was perhaps 15 by 20 feet, stone-walled, part of the original foundation construction, she understood, a ground-level room built into the hill, with a low ceiling supported by original beams, and a stone floor and a single small window set high in the north wall, perhaps 12 inches by 18 inches, that had been blocked from the outside by a piece of plywood nailed over the exterior frame. Along 3 walls were shelving units, rough lumber built in place, built into the room, not brought in, which meant they had been constructed here inside this sealed space by someone who had come in through that door before it was sealed and had spent time here working before the wall went up. On the shelves were objects wrapped in cloth. Not newspaper, not plastic, not thrown casually on the shelves the way you store things you might need again. Wrapped in cloth, each object individually wrapped. The wrapping tucked and folded with care, dozens of them. She could not count from the doorway. She could see that there were dozens. Cecily stepped past Elliot into the room. She moved to the nearest shelf and stood in front of it for a moment without touching anything. Then she reached out and lifted the cloth from the nearest object. It was a ceramic vessel, perhaps 18 inches tall and 14 inches at its widest, with a pale straw-colored glaze as its base. And on that glaze a pattern of interlocking botanical forms, leaves and seed heads and the curving stems of climbing plants, rendered in a deeper ochre and a blue that was almost black, the same blue she recognized from the tiles in the parlor fireplace. The decoration was not applied over the glaze but was part of it, fired into the surface, which meant it was not decorative in the late sense but in the original sense, the sense in which decoration and structure are one continuous intention. She lifted the cloth from the next object. A bowl, wide and low with a different pattern, geometric this time, interlocking forms that read as both natural and architectural, like a cross-section of a cell wall or the plan of a floor seen from above. And then the next, a tall cylindrical form with a pattern of overlapping scales that was recognizable as the bark of a specific tree, she thought, looking at it, of the sycamore at the bottom of the hill, the way sycamore bark peels in irregular plates. Cecily moved down the first shelf, looking at each object briefly, not touching most of them, occasionally lifting a cloth and setting it back with the careful precision of someone who knows the difference between handling and damaging. She got to the end of the first shelf and stopped and turned and looked at the 3 walls of wrapped objects, and she turned to Iris with an expression that was so carefully controlled, it was almost alarming. The expression of a person who is working very hard not to let a significant feeling become unprofessional behavior, and who is not entirely succeeding. She said, "Who built this room?" "I don't know," Iris said. "I didn't know it existed." Cecily looked at Elliot. She said, "I need to make some calls before I say what I think I'm looking at. I need to be certain before I tell you what I think this is." Iris walked back through the door and up the hallway and up the stairs. She went to the front bedroom where she had slept for the past week, where the sleeping bag was rolled out on the floor and the camping lantern was on the windowsill and the county history book was on the floor with a bookmark in the chapter about Caldwell. She sat down on the sleeping bag and looked at the window and the tree line beyond it, and she did not move for a long time. The afternoon light came through the window at the low angle of April in Kentucky. The quality of light that makes everything look like a decision has been made. She was 64 years old. She had grown up in this house and left it at 18 for nursing school and come back for Christmas and come back for her mother's funeral and come back once or twice after that, for no reason she could articulate, a compulsion she had always attributed to sentiment and was now revising. She had been given this house by a probate court because 3 men had been given the things worth wanting, and she had been given what was left. She had been told it was a charity case. She had been told her father had felt sorry for her. She had been sleeping on the floor of a condemned house on a hill because she had nothing else. And below her, in a sealed room behind a wall that had been built in the 1960s by someone who had taken the time to do it carefully, were objects wrapped in cloth that a preservation officer with 22 years of experience was struggling to be professional about. She said it out loud into the empty room because she was alone in the house with the exception of 2 people in the basement who were occupied with something else, and because the house had gotten used to hearing her voice over the past week. She had been talking to it in the way that you talk to a space when you are spending time alone in it, and have stopped pretending that silence is necessary. She said, "I am afraid I have been wrong about what I deserve my whole life. I am afraid my brothers are right, and that this was pity, that my father looked at his 4 children and made his calculations and gave each one what he thought they were suited for, and what he thought I was suited for was a house no one else wanted on a hill, no one else would climb, and that the story I have been telling myself for the past 11 days, that there was a reason, that he saw something, that leaving me this specific thing was an act of recognition and not of condescension, is the story I am telling myself, because I am 64 years old and I have been given nothing and I need it to mean something. I am afraid that whatever Cecily Drummond is looking at right now is something the state will claim or the Historical Society will manage or the lawyers will argue over for years, and that at the end of all of it, I will be back where I started with nothing, except the story of a beautiful house I was allowed to visit briefly before someone else took it. I am afraid that the thing I have always suspected is true, that the world divides its things the way my brothers divided the estate, and that what the daughter gets is what's left, and what's left is never enough, and that I have spent 11 days on the floor of a condemned house on a hill convincing myself otherwise because the alternative is to admit that everything I was dismissed about was correct. She sat with that for a long time. The light moved across the floor. She looked at the hairline crack in the plaster ceiling above her. She had been watching it since the first night, checking it each morning the way you check a thing you are afraid of, and it had not moved. It was the same crack it had been for however many years it had been a crack. It was not growing. She looked at the floor beneath the sleeping bag. White oak, Elliot had said. Original white oak sound, better than joists he had seen in buildings half this age. She thought about her father. She thought about the specific memory she had not thought about in years. She was 7 years old and her father had taken her by the hand and led her through the house on a Sunday afternoon. Not the boys, just her. She had thought at the time it was because she was small and easiest to bring along, the path of least resistance. And he had brought her to the parlor and crouched down to her height and pointed at the tiles, and he had said, "Those are the most beautiful things in this county, and nobody knows it but you and me." He had not taken Gerald. He had not taken Dennis or Paul. He had taken Iris, who was 7 years old and had no particular interest in tiles, and who had looked at them and thought, "Yes, they are pretty," and had gone back to whatever she was doing, and who had remembered those words for 57 years without understanding what they meant. She pushed herself up from the floor. She smoothed her shirt. She went downstairs. Cecily was standing in the back hallway with her phone in her hand and an expression that had moved past careful professional containment into something that was working hard and not quite managing. She looked at Iris and she said, I need to show you something. I need to tell you what I know and what I think, and I need to be clear about which is which. She led Iris to the kitchen table and set her laptop on it and opened it and turned it to face her. On the screen was a catalog page from a 1983 exhibition at the Cincinnati Art Museum. The exhibition was called Craft and Architecture, the Integrated Vision, and it had run for 6 weeks in the fall of 1983, which was not the kind of exhibition that traveled or that received national coverage, but the kind that was attended seriously by the people in the relevant fields and then filed in the institutional memory of those fields and not forgotten. In the catalog notes, in a section about the crossover between architectural ceramics and studio pottery in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there was a single paragraph about a Kentucky maker named Harlan Caldwell. The paragraph identified him as the son of the architect Robert Caldwell, trained under his father and subsequently working independently as a ceramicist and architectural ornamentation specialist, producing decorative work for several of his father's commissions as well as an independent body of studio ceramic work at the family property in Harlan County until his death in 1961. The paragraph noted that his work had been exhibited once publicly in this show from a private collection that declined to provide provenance, and that after the show the works had not been seen again. The exhibition catalog listed 7 pieces. The notes described the work as virtuosic and wholly original, representing a synthesis of architectural and ceramic traditions that had no clear precedent and no clear descendant. A body of work that appeared to have developed in complete isolation from the mainstream of American studio pottery. There was one photograph in the catalog, a black and white reproduction of a large ovoid vessel, and the glaze pattern on that vessel was identical. She did not mean similar, she meant identical to the pattern on the objects she had seen on the shelves in the sealed room. I have been looking for Harlan Caldwell's work for 11 years, Cecily said. The 7 pieces in the 1983 show came from a private collector who declined to provide provenance and whom the museum was unable to trace after the show closed. After the exhibition ended, the works disappeared. There has been no public sighting of Harlan Caldwell's ceramics since 1983. I have believed, based on documentary evidence in the family correspondence I was able to access, that there was more work, a significant body of private studio production that was never shown and never sold. I have never been able to find it. She looked at Iris. Her voice was steady and professional, and underneath it was something that was not quite steady and not quite professional. I counted 46 objects on those shelves. I need a conservator and I need a specialist in architectural ceramics to come and look at each one before I give you a number. But Iris, this is not a county story. This is not even a state story. This is a national story. This is possibly the most significant discovery of American craft work in the past 20 years, and it has been sitting behind a wall in your house for 60 years. Iris looked at the screen. She looked at the catalog page. She looked at the photograph of the ovoid vessel with the glazed pattern she recognized. She said, "My father knew it was there." It was not a question. Cecily looked at her. "Almost certainly," she said. "Given that your grandfather was the one who built the wall and your father grew up in this house, yes, he knew." The kitchen was quiet. Outside the window, the April afternoon was moving toward evening, the light going gold-gray, the creak sound rising slightly as the temperature dropped. And then Elliot's phone rang from the hallway where he had been standing, giving them room. He looked at the screen. He looked at Iris. He said, "It's Gerald." Gerald Vance did not leave a voicemail. He called Elliot's number twice in the space of 3 minutes, and then, 20 minutes later, his white pickup appeared at the bottom of the gravel road, and this time he did not stay at the road's edge. He came up the drive. He had his brother Dennis with him, 59 years old, quieter than Gerald, who ran the family's equipment rental business outside of town and who had said the least during the estate proceedings and had meant the most by his silence, in the way that quiet men in rooms full of louder people sometimes mean the most by what they don't say. and a third man that Iris did not recognize, who she would learn afterward was a property assessor from Corbin that Gerald had retained 2 days earlier, when word had apparently reached him from some source she did not identify until later that something had been found in the house on Alderman Hill, something worth getting ahead of. The three of them came up the porch steps and Gerald tried the front door, which was locked with the combination lock she had installed on her first day. Iris opened it. He looked past her into the hallway. He looked at Cecily Drummond, whom he did not know but could recognize by her bearing and the state vehicle in the drive as someone official. He looked at the open door at the end of the hallway, the 1960s frame gone, the original door visible in the stone surround. He looked at Elliot standing to the left with his notebook. He said, "I heard you open something up down there." "Word travels," Elliot said. Gerald looked at Iris. His expression had changed from the one he had worn at the road's edge 3 days ago, the patient, slightly amused expression of a man who knows the ending, to something more focused, something that was not quite alarm but was its predecessor, the expression of a man updating a calculation in real time. "I have a buyer under pressure," he said, "a serious buyer with a real number. And I need to know if there's anything in this house that's going to complicate the title or delay the close." "There's nothing complicating the title," Iris said, "because I'm not selling." Gerald's expression changed again. It moved past focused updating into the more particular look of a man who has decided that patience has a limit, and that limit has been reached. He said, "Iris, I've let you have your few weeks up here. I understand it's been an emotional time and that the house has memories and all of that. But you have no income coming in. You have no savings that I know of. You have no plan, and you cannot afford to restore this property. I've had people look at what it would cost to bring this house to habitable code, and you're looking at $300,000 at minimum, likely more. I've looked at the numbers. $140,000 is real money for someone in your situation. It will give you something to stand on. What you're doing right now is letting sentiment make a financial decision, and sentiment does not pay property taxes." "I want to show you something," Iris said. She led him downstairs. She led all three of them, Gerald, Dennis, and the assessor from Corbin, whose name she had not been given and did not ask, through the back hallway and through the opened wall and into the sealed room. Cecily had spent the afternoon unwrapping 8 of the objects and arranging them on a cloth she had laid on the stone floor in the light from a work lamp Elliot had set up on a tripod against the far wall, angled to illuminate the pieces from the side rather than above, the way you light ceramics when you want to show the depth of the glaze and the quality of the surface rather than just the shape. The ceramics sat in that light and did what great made things do when they are finally given the space they deserve. They stopped the room. Gerald stood at the entrance of the sealed room and looked. He did not step forward. He stood at the threshold with his hand on the doorframe, and he looked at the 8 pieces arranged on the cloth in the work lamp light. The ovoid vessel, the wide bowl, the tall cylindrical form with the bark pattern, and 5 others that Cecily had selected as representative of the range. And he was quiet in a way Gerald Vance was not often quiet. Dennis stood behind him. The assessor from Corbin stood behind Dennis. No one spoke for a full 30 seconds, which is longer than it sounds in a silent room. Then Gerald said, "What is this?" It was not quite a question. It was the sound of a man asking a question he already partly knows the answer to and is hoping not to hear confirmed. "Harlan Caldwell's complete studio production," Cecily Drummond said, from her position beside the work lamp. She said it with the specific calm of someone who has been waiting for the opportunity to say a particular sentence for a very long time, and is now saying it in the correct room in front of the correct people. 46 documented works intact in original condition, representing the full private output of a ceramicist whose 7 exhibited pieces sold through a 1983 Cincinnati auction for a combined total of $62,000. That was 1983. The market for this period of American craft work has changed considerably in the past 35 years. Gerald looked at the ceramics. He looked at Iris. He said, This was here the whole time. It was not quite a question. It was the sound of a man experiencing the specific vertigo of learning that the story he thought he knew was the wrong story. As far as Cecily can determine, Iris said, your grandfather sealed this room sometime in the early 1960s after Harlan Caldwell died. The 1960s framing confirms the decade. And your father grew up in this house. He knew this room was here. The silence that followed that sentence was a specific kind of silence that is different from ordinary quiet. It was the silence of three men absorbing a piece of information that reorganizes the recent past. Dennis, behind Gerald, sat down slowly on the bottom step of the basement stairs, not as a dramatic gesture, but because his legs had apparently made their own decision. The assessor from Corbin took a step backward, which was the instinct of a man who has just understood that he is in a situation that is not what he was told it was. Gerald looked at his sister across the sealed room and the work lamp and the 8 pieces of Harlan Caldwell's ceramics arranged on a cloth on the stone floor, and his face went through several things in quick succession, none of which were comfortable to observe, and which she observed anyway, fully, without looking away. He never told us, Gerald said. It came out quieter than his voice usually came out. No, Iris said. He didn't. The formal appraisal process was initiated the following week. Cecily's office contacted a specialist in American studio ceramics and architectural pottery at the Smithsonian's Archives of American Art, who came to Alderman Hill on May 3rd with a conservator from the University of Kentucky and spent 2 full days with the collection. A second independent appraisal was commissioned by Raymond Cole. The estate's attorney, Patsy Greer, had located for Iris in the days after the discovery, a man in his late 50s who had handled contested estate cases in Kentucky for 30 years and who Patsy had described as unhurried and unbluffable, which turned out to be accurate. The formal appraisal was completed on May 19, 2018. The collection was valued at $1.1 million at conservative auction estimate, with a noted upper range of $1.6 million based on the exceptional nature of the provenance, a complete, undivided body of work from a single maker, fully documented, intact in its original location, with the architectural context of the Caldwell-built house as a physical and historical frame for the work. The formal proceedings were held on June 4, 2018, a Monday, in the offices of Raymond Cole on Main Street in Grover's Mill. The parties were Iris Vance on one side and Gerald Vance, appearing on behalf of himself and his brother Dennis on the other. There was a third man in the room, a cultural property attorney from Louisville that Gerald had retained in the 2 weeks since the discovery, whose name Iris did not learn and did not particularly want to. Cecily Drummond was present as a material witness for the preservation record. Patsy Greer had driven 3 hours from Lexington and was sitting in the corner chair by the window with her hands folded in her lap and her reading glasses on, and the expression of someone who has driven 3 hours to witness something and intends to witness every word of it. Gerald had engaged the cultural property attorney to argue that the collection, having been part of the family property prior to the estate division and its existence having been unknown at the time of the proceedings, constituted a shared family asset that had not been properly addressed by the probate order and should be divided equally among the 4 heirs. It was a coherent argument. Raymond Cole had filed a counter-argument that was more coherent, that the sealed room and its contents were structural and spatial elements of the property as awarded in the probate order, that the probate court had not been informed of the collection's existence, which was a question of disclosure that Raymond had noted in a separate filing to the court, and that the collection was the sole legal property of Iris Vance by virtue of the property award and required no further division. He also noted, with the careful precision of someone placing a sentence on the record rather than making a threat, that the question of who had known about the sealed room and when they had known it was a matter that the court might wish to examine as a separate proceeding. The cultural property attorney made his argument. Raymond made his. Gerald sat at his end of the table with the summary appraisal document open in front of him, and he looked at it for a long time, and Iris watched him and said nothing. Then Gerald set the document down and looked at her, and he said, "You should have sold when I told you to. You had nothing. Now you have a problem you don't know how to manage, and a collection you don't understand, and lawyers you can't afford for as long as this takes. You've always needed someone to take care of things for you, Iris. That's the truth. Dad knew it. We all know it. Let us help you manage this the right way, and you'll come out of it with more than you would have otherwise." Patsy Greer, in the corner, put her pen down on the notepad in her lap. She put it down with a deliberateness that was itself a kind of sentence. Raymond Cole looked at his notepad without writing anything. Cecily Drummond looked at the table. Iris looked at her brother. She was 64 years old. She had driven up a gravel road to a house she had been told was worthless, and she had slept on its floor and listened to its walls and put on her work gloves and gone room by room, and she had heard an architect say the words sound and intact and original and extraordinary. She had watched a preservation officer stand in a parlor doorway and say, "There you are," to a set of tiles that had been waiting 11 years for her to find them. She had sat on a sleeping bag on a floor and been afraid, truly afraid, of all the things she had always been afraid of being the charity case, of being the one who got what was left, of being wrong about what she deserved. And she had sat with that fear until it was finished with her. And then she had stood up. She had stood up because a man who had taken her by the hand when she was 7 years old and led her to a parlor and crouched down to her height and said, "Those are the most beautiful things in the county, and nobody knows it. But you and me had, 40 years later, with the full understanding of what he was doing, left her the house that contained them. He had seen her. He had been seeing her the whole time. And he had left her the most beautiful thing in the county and had trusted her to find out why." She said, "He left it to me." 5 words. Quiet. Not a challenge and not a declaration, but a statement of fact, delivered with the finality of something that has been true for a long time and does not require Gerald's acknowledgement to remain true. Gerald opened his mouth. Raymond Cole said, calmly and without inflection, "My client is finished." The mediation concluded in Iris's favor 3 weeks later on June 25th. The collection was confirmed as the sole property of Iris Vance, not subject to division, held entirely within the scope of the property award as issued. The question of non-disclosure, specifically whether Gerald and Dennis Vance had possessed knowledge of the sealed room's existence prior to the estate proceedings, was referred to the Harlan County Probate Court for independent review. That review process took 14 months. It concluded in August 2019 with a finding that Gerald Vance had been specifically informed of the sealed room and its contents by their father, Wallace Vance, in a conversation in 2014, 4 years before the estate division, and had not disclosed this information to the probate court, to the attorneys of record, or to Iris. That finding had consequences that extended beyond the estate proceedings and that Iris did not follow closely because she had other things to attend to. She did not watch her brothers leave the office on June 4th. She sat at the table for a moment after they had gone and looked at the window and the Main Street afternoon outside it, and she thought about the parlor tiles and the pressed tin cornice and the white oak joists and the stone room behind the wall. Then she looked at Patsy, who was already on her feet with her coat on and her keys in her hand and her reading glasses folded on top of her notepad. "Come on," Patsy said. "I drove 3 hours. You're buying me lunch and you're going to tell me everything about that room." The Harlan Caldwell collection was acquired in its entirety by the Kentucky Art and Craft Foundation in March 2019 for $1.4 million, under an agreement that Iris and Raymond Cole had negotiated over 4 months with care, and with several points of principle that Iris had insisted on and that Raymond had supported. The agreement specified that the collection would be held intact, not divided, not sold in parts, not dispersed among multiple institutions, and exhibited as a unified body of work. It specified that a portion of the proceeds would fund ongoing documentation and preservation of craft work in eastern Kentucky, a region whose artistic heritage had been systematically underdocumented for a century. And it specified the name under which the collection would be held and exhibited, which was, at Iris's specific and non-negotiable request, the Robert and Harlan Caldwell Collection, Alderman Hill, Harlan County, Kentucky. The foundation had suggested a simpler name. Iris had said no. She wanted the hill in the name. She wanted the county in the name. She wanted the two men who had built the house and filled the room to be named together, father and son, architect and ceramicist, the one who made the space and the one who filled it. The foundation had agreed. Iris did not sell the house. She hired Elliot Marsh to oversee the restoration, which he began in the fall of 2018 and which took 18 months and which was funded by the acquisition proceeds and by a historic preservation grant that Cecily Drummond helped her apply for. A grant she had been eligible for since the moment Elliot filed his structural certification in April. The restoration was careful and was not fast, and was exactly what the house required. The parlor ceiling was stabilized and cleaned, the two cracks in the plaster filled by a specialist in historic plaster repair who came from Cincinnati because there was no one in Kentucky with her specific skill. The tiles were professionally cleaned and documented, each one photographed and measured and described in a conservation record that would travel with the house's historic designation. The east porch was rebuilt using salvaged material of the correct period. The front windows were restored to operation, each sash planed and weighted and rehung so that they opened with the ease of windows that have been cared for and not the resistance of windows that have been fighting time alone. The house was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in August 2020, 27 months after Iris had sat in the driver's seat of her 12-year-old Subaru at the bottom of the gravel road and decided to get out. On the day the letter arrived from the National Register, Iris went upstairs to the front bedroom and sat down on the floor, not on the sleeping bag, which was long gone, but on the restored hardwood floor in the restored bedroom of a restored house. And she sat in the same position she had been in when she had been most afraid, back against the wall, looking at the window and the tree line, and she stayed there for a while. She thought about her father. She thought about the specific afternoon when she was 7 years old and he had taken her hand. She thought about a man who had grown up in this house and had known what was in the room behind the wall and had known which of his children to leave it to and had trusted that person to find it without being told, to drive up the hill and go inside and put on her work gloves and say, "I'll get an assessment," to refuse to sell when a brother she had been deferring to since she was 9 years old told her she was a charity case and there was no other option. She thought about how trust works, the specific trust of leaving someone something significant without explanation. The trust that says, "I know you well enough to know you will find out why." She thought, "He saw me." She thought, "He always saw me." She thought she might be working on that for the rest of her life. She thought that was probably the right amount of time. 6 months after the acquisition closed, in September 2019, Iris established a fund through Raymond Cole's Office for Women in Harlan County and the surrounding region who had received property in estate divisions that others had dismissed as worthless and who needed legal counsel and professional assessment to understand and protect what they had been given. She called it the Alderman Hill Fund. It was not a large fund, but it was specific in its purpose, and Raymond administered it carefully, and it found its recipients without being advertised because Harlan County is not a large county, and word moves. The first recipient was a woman named May Tolliver, 68 years old, from a farm outside of Evarts, whose 3 brothers had divided their parents' farm and had given May the woodlot on the north side and the old tobacco barn at the back of the property, both of which they had assessed as worthless acreage and a structure that would need to come down. The woodlot turned out to contain a stand of old-growth tulip poplar that a regional conservation organization was prepared to pay substantially to preserve through a conservation easement. The tobacco barn turned out to contain, in the loft above the hanging bays, 50 years of her father's handmade furniture, chairs and tables and blanket chests, and a rocking chair he had made for May's mother when they married, which a folk art specialist identified as representing a significant body of vernacular Kentucky craftwork, complete and in original condition. May Tolliver received legal representation through the Alderman Hill Fund and negotiated both the conservation easement and the folk art assessment from a position of full information and professional support. When it was over, she drove to Alderman Hill and sat at Iris's kitchen table, the kitchen of the restored house, with the cast iron drain board still over the sink and the original cabinets repainted in the original color, and the window looking out over the hill going gold-green with September, and she said, "My brothers told me I got nothing." Iris poured coffee. She thought about a gravel road and a 12-year-old Subaru and a marble fireplace and a wall that was not original and a man who had crouched to the height of a 7-year-old girl and said, "Those are the most beautiful things in the county and nobody knows it but you and me." "I know exactly how that feels," she said. What I keep coming back to in Iris's letter is her father, a man who spent his daughter's whole life watching her be overlooked and who left her the one thing that proved everyone wrong, and never told her what it was. I've thought about why. I think he trusted her to find out. I think he believed she was the only one who would go up that road and go inside and stay. He was right. Every letter I receive reminds me of the same thing. The people the world gives up on are often the ones who were worth the most all along. If you've ever been given the thing nobody wanted and found out later what it really was, leave me a comment. I want to hear your story. And if this one stayed with you, stay with this channel. There are more letters. There always are.